Hey everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
And welcome back to another edition of our Hot-ish Takes, which is our video series where we like to take a rather topical topic and dig deeper into it, do some analyzing and explaining. The previous one we did to this was on the Boy Scouts of America sexual abuse scandal. If you're a fan of our YouTube channel at all, you know that we talk about institutions and abuse quite regularly. It is a slightly sad hobby of ours that we like to dig into. And we had a comment at the end of the Boy Scouts video that a lovely viewer would be interested in hearing more about abuse and institutions in Ireland. Thus, we have a hottish take on the 2015 French-made documentary Children of Shame, which explores the issue of mother and baby homes in the Republic of Ireland. What are mother and baby homes? If you are new to this topic, great question. I will explain briefly what they are, and then Dr. Kristen is going to explain why they are and why they are unique in their incarnation on the island of Ireland. So, as happened throughout the 19th century across Europe, workhouses existed in Ireland where people who were impoverished for various reasons or shunned by society for various reasons were sent to these separate buildings, institutions to work. Unwed, pregnant women were also sent to these workhouses in Ireland. Eventually, for reasons we will explain, those women were separated from the other people at the workhouses, and they created separate institutions, separate workhouses that were called mother and baby homes. They were specific places that unwed pregnant women were sent to work, to live, to give birth to their babies. Sometimes the children stayed there. Sometimes they were sent into foster care. More often than not, they were adopted and sold into adoption by the religious orders. And that's the other important part of the mother and baby homes. They were run by specifically religious orders of nuns across the island of Ireland. And so the Catholic Church plays a big role in this. So Children of Shame comes about in 2015. It's produced in 2015, right around the time of the start of an investigation, a commission on mother and baby homes and the treatment of women and children in these homes by the religious orders. And so it's a period of time in Ireland where we're really examining the role of institutions and specifically the Catholic Church and abuse in a lot of different ways. And we'll talk more about that later in the hottish take. But I kind of wanted to set the stage if this is something that you are unfamiliar with. And so the documentary follows several children and several women who were at mother and baby homes across the country, but it specifically starts with the story of the Bon Secours sisters' mother and baby home in Tuam in County Galway, which is in the west of Ireland, and the believed discovery of a mass grave of children, 759 remains in a mass grave outside of the Bon Secours mother and baby home. And so that's the starting point for this documentary, and really for this investigation and this commission was a report in the Irish Times by a very intrepid reporter who kind of exposed on a national scale the potential existence of this mass grave. So that is our
2012, right? That's when they found it, wasn't it?
The article
2013.
The article was in 2014.
14. Okay. Apologies.
No, that's okay. That's why I wrote some of these things down, because I even get confused about that. And Alison O'Reilly was the publisher, the author of the article, and she published all of the names. She did the digging and wanted to find the names of the victims buried in this mass grave. And she was actually able to locate all the children who died at this particular mother and baby home, and their deaths were recorded. Their death certificates existed, but no grave for them existed on the official records. And so it opened the proverbial can of worms, really. But the documentary covers so much in the hour-long like whirlwind through Irish Catholicism and shame and motherhood and womanness and national identity. But it's done very empathetically. It's done by centering victims and survivors, which is always something we want to highlight. It's available on Amazon, we should say, to rent for 99 cents. It is worth every literal cent and way more than that. And we can't recommend it enough. But we thought it was a great opportunity to explore the ways that this horror of power and institutional abuse and cover-ups and scandals intersects particularly on the island of Ireland. And aren't we so lucky we have our very own socio-religious expert on our panel today, joining us live via Zoom, the esteemed Dr. Kristen Donnelly, a literal expert in this. So, Dr. Kristen, why mother and baby homes?
Why Ireland? I mean, there's just so couple things right off the bat. One, the word we use in theological studies for when a particular kind of faith and a particular culture kind of mix together so that that religion looks very specific in that very specific place is syncretism. Syncretism happens and it is very common. It is in Christianity not really a problem. In Islam, it's more of a debate kind of thing. But because Christianity is based on the idea of a God putting skin on and becoming human, we actually quite like kind of the religion looking quite cultural,
right?
And so it tends to not be something that we wring a whole host of hands over. In the last 10 years, we've started a little bit more aggressively because of things like this.
So it's when the culture reflects the religiosity, or
it's when the religiosity reflects the culture.
Oh, okay. So the practice of the religion
looks very culturally specific.
Okay.
And things about the religion then have evolved in a way that might not be considered pure or orthodox. So there's really like innocuous forms of this.
Right.
Like, you know, in America, Protestants don't use, most Protestants outside of the Episcopal Church don't use actual wine for communion. Because the cultures they were in were about fighting alcoholism. And so they use grape juice. Like, that's pretty innocuous.
Right. And in Ireland, I think what's so interesting before you get further into that is how Catholicism was brought to Ireland.
Yes.
And I, as the non-religious expert, I still used to randomly teach about St. Patrick when I was in Ireland. And he was very intentional, and the early Catholic monastery development in Ireland was very intentional about marrying Catholicism with kind of the pagan Celtic identity. In a way that was very different than Catholicism in other parts of the world. And St. Patrick in particular was like, well, if I'm going to get people to sign on to this new theology I have going, I'm going to speak to them in their literal language in Irish Gaelic, and I'm going to use symbols and ideas that they understand to explain these religious concepts, and hopefully it'll stick a little bit better. And guess what? Patrick was a pretty smart dude. So
and he was pretty revolutionary in missions at the time, in missionary life at the time. Like, this sounds really logical to us. It wasn't for about 1,500 years, and so like, and the evolutions of the Catholic Church politically are a whole separate, honestly, lecture series. But Ireland was exempt from some of them because it was physically, literally removed from the continent of Europe. And getting to Ireland was often a bit of a thing. So like, it was a little bit trickier. And the Irish just kind of ran off a lot of people.
Okay. So we're at syncretism. So we're at
syncretism. So all of this to say, Irish Catholicism is a very specific thing.
Yes.
And so I want you to put a pin in that. Then I want you to remember that it is super common for national identity to be centered around women.
Mm-hmm.
So we refer to things as Mother Ireland, the motherland. In America, we are kind of, two of our national symbols are Rosie the Riveter and Lady Liberty, and they are very We actually, like, they are stronger than Uncle Sam in a lot of ways. Like, they are the beacons of who America is. This is super, super common. So because of that, the women tend to be put into a role in many countries of protecting and mothering the entire nation.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing that, subconsciously, what that means is that they're also in charge of the next generation carrying on the national identity. They
Right.
do this through the education, but mostly through the bearing of children. If your national identity is connected to this very specific form of faith that venerates a virgin and says that the ultimate example of womanhood is a life of celibate service, you can imagine how they felt about a whole lot of girls having sex outside of wedlock.
There's not a whole lot of room in that scenario for any sort of
single moms a go-go. Like, there's not really
immoral behavior. Yeah.
So then all of this, it's very, very common in like post-Victorian England, Ireland, and America.
Right.
To kind of believe that moral behavior is contagious.
Right.
So like so it's very important to have, and honestly, like Victoria did so much of this, but Edward didn't help either, who came after Victoria. And the Prince Regent didn't help. Like the British monarchy set so much more of the culture then than they do now, especially because they're still behaving like then, but that's a separate conversation. And so you had to excise anybody who was threatening to contaminate your idea of a pure Ireland. And that like every country has stereotypes about itself that are false. Every single one throughout all of history. That's part of imagined nationalism, which is, and that's what you sell to people. That's how you get national pride. Like, FYI, not everybody was in a munitions factory in 1950, but if you watched the propaganda commercials, you certainly believed they were. And so it's this kind of story. The story that Ireland has always told about itself is that it is oppressed, and that they, especially in this time in the 1880s to like 1920s, before the Civil War and the emancipation of 2/3 of the island, they are an oppressed people who are Catholics in a country that is not a Catholic country. And they've been murdered for their faith. That is true. And they have to maintain the purity. They are the light of Rome in the British Isles.
Right.
They are surrounded by pagans who are going to hell, i.e. Protestants. And they have to protect Ireland, which means they have to raise children in the Catholic Church. So all of this is lame. If you are a lady who has gotten herself pregnant, as they would say, or if you are a girl who is in a relationship that it results in pregnancy and then therefore are separated from the dude because there were never father and baby homes, ever, and they had to do something about it. So when we get the moral contagion panic, which is real big, 1890 to 1915-ish in Europe, is when we really is what the push to mother and baby homes happens, because the mothers are morally contagious. Yeah. We have to separate them.
Yeah, and that point was brought up really, really well by the two fantastic women academics in this documentary. But Lindsay Erner Byrne is a historian at University College Dublin, and she really does such a great job of talking about how these women were, and she uses that word, morally contagious. And the peak of, particularly in Tuam, the mother and baby home in Tuam, the Bon Secours, the infant deaths, the child mortality that they're looking at is from 1925 to 1961. So that fits along with this timeline of when the mother and baby home started to be widespread across Ireland.
So we hit 1925, and you've got Ireland, the Irish Free State happening, which is interesting mess for about 15 years while they write their constitution.
After a very bloody civil war from 1923.
Very bloody civil war.
1923, yes.
But the idea that Ireland was Catholic was forefront of everything. So they don't have an official relationship with the Catholic Church. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Sure, okay, but they do. And there's some academic debate over whether the Bishop of Dublin like wrote half the Constitution or just had a lot of say over the Constitution. But there is Catholic theology in the Irish Constitution.
Right.
Everywhere, in my opinion, and I'm not alone, and Dr. Erin agrees, and she's not alone, and it's a very Catholic country for a whole lot of reasons.
Yeah, and the person who was the leader during this time, and the author, one of the main authors of the Constitution, Eamon de Valera, who was the Prime Minister and then the President of Ireland for over a period of like 25 years, he held these two positions of the highest office. And is one of the most influential figures in modern Irish politics, 20th century Irish politics, was a very devout Catholic, fostered this relationship with the Archbishop of Dublin, whom I think was his teacher.
Yeah, at Blackrock House or Academy or whatever we call it. Yeah, college.
Blackrock College, growing up, and so influenced Eamon de Valera. But de Valera also had this very kind of traditional, almost archaic view of Ireland, of this Gaelic traditional Ireland,
yes.
And particularly of women's role within that. And so that existed in him as a political agent, as the most prominent political agent, and shaped, honest to God, so much of what Ireland is today. And so you can't, and he's mentioned in the documentary, certainly, but as one of the authors of the Constitution especially, you can't understate the influence of Eamon de Valera.
And so two of the things that are most relevant to this particular conversation is that written into the Constitution is the illegality of both divorce and abortion.
Mm-hmm.
So, spoiler alert, humans cheat on their spouses. And children happen outside of covenantal marriage.
Uh-huh.
And there was a couple ways to deal with this. And the mother and baby homes continued to be the way that they did. It prospered, that's the word I'm looking for, because this was also the main way that the nuns' orders made money. They sold these children. And it's a really, I need to call a spade a spade. Like, Ireland in the 20th century didn't have a lot of cash.
Yeah.
And all of these mother and baby homes, with the exception of maybe two, if I'm looking at the map, were in fairly rural parts of the country where like you were relying on potatoes and mushrooms and the kindness of strangers. Mm-hmm. So like they needed the cash.
Yeah, Tuam is a very small town in very rural part of Galway, and almost all of Galway is rural.
Like there's not a lot of employment opportunities.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of very desperate people who wanted children, especially in Catholic Irish America, where women who couldn't have children were judged and being told that they were less than. So if you can't bear your own Catholic child, raise a Catholic child that came from somewhere else. And what better place than the motherland?
And the homeland, yeah.
So this whole narrative happens. Some of this may be ticking in your brain as like, I've heard this story before. And it's because it's the movie Philomena with Judi Dench and Steve Coogan. That was 2013, I think. I can't remember.
2013, based on the 2009 book. And Correct. It is a true story.
Yes.
But yes, 2013. So this is all happening around the same time where kind of the social consciousness of Ireland and pop culture is like, oh, wait, hey, what about these things?
Yeah. And I'm the obnoxious researcher. So we were living in Northern Ireland at the time that movie came out. And I started to become the person that was like, do you know anybody that went to a mother and baby home? What are these Magdalene laundries? Tell me all about them.
Like to talk to me about, excuse me.
Hi. We are drunk together in a pub. Can you tell me about your family's traumas? And here's the crazy thing, guys. Everyone did.
They do. Oh boy, do they.
Yeah, they don't. Part of this documentary I want to bring up before we move on to anything else is that sometimes, and in a lot of countries, outsiders get the best stories.
Yes.
Outsiders can be exceptionally damaging, and we need to be super, super careful. But sometimes they get the unvarnished, especially on that island. I think you can feel free to ask us why in the comments, but we have some theories as to why that particular group of cultures
Yes.
Particularly works with an outsider perspective. But all of this to say, mother and baby homes were something that, in my limited research and colloquial knowledge, nearly like everybody kind of knew about in the Republic.
Oh yeah.
Like, girls disappeared. But it wasn't a country that asked questions because they were told they couldn't.
Yeah.
Especially pre-Vatican II, Catholicism is not about asking questions or being curious. Post-Vatican II, Catholicism is much more.
Yeah.
It has more room for it. But if I listen to my in-laws, even though Vatican II happened in the 60s, like my mother-in-law jokes that it happened in Ireland in the 90s. So right. Like, and my mother-in-law grew up in a part of the island where she didn't have indoor plumbing when she was a kid, because rural Ireland is still, it still exists, and it still kind of goes with that. So you just know it happens, but you also don't think you can do anything about it.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you're getting international attention. Inquiries are happening. You're part of the European Union, so you're subject to the human rights commissions of the European Union. You've got a bunch of immigrants. You've got young folks who did not grow up with mother and baby homes and had no idea this was part of their country's history and don't know what's going on. And they're advocating for change. There are very few groups of people as passionate as a group of Irish youths who want change. Please Google the repeal the eighth to see what we're talking about.
And marriage equality. Yeah.
And marriage equality. Oh my gosh. Get the boat to vote is like still one of the best hashtags of all time.
It is. Yeah. Home to vote.
So you've got this whole combination, and we hit 21st century, like post 2010 Dublin is like, oh God, we need to stop being Catholic. Oh God. And so
this was damaging.
Oh crap. So you've got, like Dr. Hinson mentioned in the beginning, quite a few inquiries into abuse in institutions.
Yeah.
In the Republic, there are a couple up north too. That's a different country, and so different legal procedures. But focusing on the Republic, that's really like, that's been happening.
Yeah.
But like, from what we know of the timeline, like, justice is really slow. One, justice is really complicated. Some of these children who are now flourishing and living their best life somewhere in Cork may have absolutely no idea they were ever adopted.
Yeah.
Some of these women did not have good lives after they left, and that brings being an adopted child in a lot of Ireland, we hear from people in this documentary, was very shameful for a while. And that wasn't accepted or good. Everything is really messy. You then take the legalities of when they can acknowledge the deaths to give people burials, and the fact that burial procedures is incredibly specific in Irish Catholicism, and the rituals around burials and mourning are very specific. And this is all emotional and messy.
Yeah, and a couple of things that I just wanted to make sure that we pointed out is to talk a little bit for a few minutes about these investigations. And also, Dr. Kristen brought up kind of the influx of immigrant communities and immigrant constituents to Ireland. And certainly the economic boom in the 1990s, the Celtic Tiger, which brought a huge influx of workers from other areas of Europe as a part of the European Union, is a huge part of changing the demographics of Ireland, and especially in the capital city of Dublin. But you get immigrant communities and immigrants all over the island. And so that is a really important part of understanding why in the early 2000s, we start to get these stories being much more public about institutions and institutional abuse. And the quote at the beginning of the documentary, which is, I still think, one of the best quotes I've ever heard about Ireland, is, "There is a tendency in Ireland not to talk about things in public." And that encapsulated literally everything that Dr. Kristen just said about why everybody knew that mother and baby homes existed, but nobody talked about it. And the same goes for institutional abuse within the Catholic Church, from Catholic-run orphanages and boys' schools to with altar boys in Catholic churches and dioceses across the nation. The planet, yes. But specific to Ireland, we start to get stories coming out in the mid-2000s about large-scale, widespread abuse within the Catholic Church. And we get the Ryan Report was the end result of that, which looked into institutional abuse, and that was published in 2009. Then you have the early 2010s where, Martin Sixsmith's book, Philomena, which was 2009, so the same time as the Ryan Report, starts to draw attention to mother and baby homes. The tomb scandal, which I checked my notes and I was incorrect, 795, not 759 infant and child remains, which I think is important to note. But that comes about 2013, 2014. We get the Mother and Baby Homes Commission as well, that started, I think, in 2014.
I think so too. I was still there. So I think 2014.
Yeah, 2014 for the Mother and Baby Homes Commission. The report for that commission was due to be released in July of this year. It was delayed. It has been delayed numerous times, as we talked about. Institutions and justice are slow. It has been completed and submitted to the health minister in the Dublin government, in the Irish government, at the end of October. So we anticipate a release, hopefully sometime in the early months of 2021, to see what the recommendations are, what the findings are. And that it's hoped that that report will help us be able to officially recognize the mass grave, reconsecrate the remains, put up a plaque. There's not even a plaque or a memorial because they can't officially put up a plaque until it's officially designated a grave. It's very complicated. But it's worth noting that these investigations and this public accountability is a huge part of uncovering all of this. And there's been a historical institutional abuse inquiry in Northern Ireland that started in 2014 and ran for 2 years and is now in the process of providing compensation to victims and survivors of institutions, not mother and baby homes specifically, more orphanages and schools that were run by religious orders across Northern Ireland. But it was certainly something that happened island-wide, regardless of state borders. And hopefully from these reports, we will see some attempt at restitution for these victims and survivors. But one of the things that the documentary does so well at the end is showcase how complicated trauma is and how multifaceted justice is, and that people experience trauma differently, they reconcile with it differently, they heal differently, and because of that, they want different things in terms of justice for themselves. And for some people, that could be anonymity. They just want to be left alone to live their lives, and all the way across the spectrum to people who want public accountability. They want names in the paper. They want people to go to jail. So it becomes really, really messy to determine, who has been wronged and how they want any sort of restoration out of this process. And so it's exceptionally complicated everywhere. It's the same thing we're seeing with these scandals here in the United States. We've talked a lot about the USA Gymnastics scandal on our hot-ish takes. Upwards of 500 young girls and women were victims of Larry Nassar, and you might get 500 different answers about what they want to see happen, but certainly a very wide spectrum of it. So it's a valuable documentary, even just to show that this type of situation is very messy. The specifics of Ireland make it complicated in a way that's different to other places where there are abuse scandals. And we're not sure what justice looks like, and we're not sure if it will happen. But anytime you can give space and give voice to these people's stories and experiences and validate their lived experiences and trauma on a platform like this, you will find the good doctors ready to watch and talk about it.
Absolutely. We believe strongly in bearing witness and holding space. We don't believe in saying never again, because everything will always happen again in a certain way. Mm-hmm. We're too pragmatic for that. But we will say that we believe the world is bent towards justice, and the way it is accomplished is by learning lessons. And you learn lessons by listening. And so we're honored that we had 59 minutes to listen to this group of people. We encourage you to do the same. We had a really hard time finding this documentary. There's not a lot of video media coverage on this particular topic. If you know something that we don't, we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah.
That goes for institutional abuse cases across the island of Ireland. Everything I can find is about English things, which is fine, but that's not what y'all asked us to talk about. So if you know stuff that we don't, we'd love to cover it. In the meantime, we encourage you to believe survivors, be gentle with those in trauma, and seek justice as best you can.
That's it for this hot-ish take. We'll see you guys next time.